Hi, my name is Emily and this is the Caban baby quilt. I had a lot of fabric left over, so I decided to make a baby quilt for my baby boy. There are very detailed instructions in the description box below. This quilt consists of plain squares and checkered squares. The plain squares are really easy to make. The checkered squares need a bit more attention. We're starting by cutting all the tiny squares of the checkered squares, and I'm cutting multiple fabric at once. I'm cutting longer strips first, and then I'm cutting tiny squares out of them. Make sure to align the straight edge with one of the lines on your cutting mat. Now I'm cutting the larger squares. That's very straightforward. Once you cut everything out, you can start making the checkered squares. You lay the pattern of one checkered square next to your sewing machine. We're going to sew the first two columns together, and you do this by placing the second column of the squares on top of the first, and then you sew them at the right side at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You don't have to backstitch at the end or the beginning, and you can immediately go on the second pair without lifting the pressure foot. They're still attached to each other, and we're cutting them to separate them from each other. It's time to open the squares up, and with quilting it's really important to finger press all the seams. This ensures all the seams lock in place, and this will get you a straight looking patchwork top. The way you can lock the seam is by alternating the direction of the seams. So we're pressing all the seams of the first row to the right, the second row to the left, and then the third row to the right again. This is how a locked seam looks like. The seams should be facing away from each other. Now we can place the third column on top of the second column and do the exact same thing as we did before. Then we press the seams to either the right or the left. And then we're ready to finish this checkered square. Place the second row on top of the first row and sew them at the bottom at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Give it a final finger press, and your first checkered square is done. If you want to go a little bit faster, you can also lay out 2 checkered squares. Just be careful not to mix up the order of the squares because they are slightly different in pattern. Another tip: if you want to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can use painter's tape to mark where the edge of the square needs to be. This helps you sewing straight. If you're done with all your squares, you lay them on a large surface. You alternate the plain squares with the checkered squares. One row consists of 5 squares, and I have 7 rows in total. You can lay them out in the same way I did. You can find the pattern in the photographs and in the instructions below. Now it's time to sew the patchwork together, and you do this basically in the same way as you made the checkered squares. Start by stacking all the squares on top of each other, and you start at the left and you go to the right, so the left square is on top of your stack. Do this for all the columns and then bring the pile to your sewing machine. Place the first square and the second square. The second square needs to go right next to the first square, and you place them with the right sides together, or with the good sides, and you sew them at the right at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You open it up and you press the seam to the left, and then you can place the next square of the pile right of the second square, and you repeat the same. You finger press the first column to the left and then the second column to the right, and so on. If you have sewn all the columns together, you can now sew these columns together. Voila! Give it a final press to make it look really nice, and then we can start on the backing. I chose for a fleece fabric, and don't do a batting in between because fleece is already quite warm, so you spread out the fleece fabric on a large surface, and then you can place your patchwork on top of it. I chose to cut the backing 1.5 inches away from patchwork top, but I would recommend doing this after you have sewn the 2 layers together, because it will move still a little bit. I use painter's tape to mark where the hand stitches need to be, and they need to be on all the plain squares in a diagonal line. Start by putting your needle in between the 2 layers of fabric and tie a knot at the end. Then you can go through both the layers and start the hand stitching following the diagonal line you just made. The border is very easy to make. It's basically a hem, and then you blind stitch this to the patchwork. If you're making a blind stitch, you try to stay under the border so you don't see the stitching, and you only go through the patchwork top and then in between the 2 layers of your border, and then you go out again and picking up the patchwork top. If you reach a corner, you fold the axis of backing 90 degrees to the adjacent side, and then you fold this again over your patchwork top, and then you also sew the diagonal line in the corner as well. If you stitch the corner in place, you can go back to the center of the corner and then you can resume making the border in the same way as you did before. If you're running out of threads, then you can insert a new thread next to the end of your previous one and tie the 2 ends together. And then you can hide these 2 threads inside your border. And that's it, your baby quilt is done.